Hello and welcome back to the Renewable Energy Technology course. I am Miro and this is a continuation on the first lecture of biofuels. We still talk about simple biofuels via natural biochemical processes, and now we will focus on ethanol, the typical ethanol alcohol fuel via fermentation. The fermentation process is actually a very naturally occurring process which is initiated by microorganisms very similar to the common bread yeast cultures. You can use bread yeast as a fermenting initiator. Simple sugars, such as the ones found in fruits or in sugar beet or sugar cane, saccharose and glucose, fructose, they can easily be treated or fermented via fermentation. The fermentation is actually a kind of an anaerobic reaction of organic molecules or bi-organic molecules with something that exchanges electrons, but not with oxygen, however with those organic molecules. As a result, a certain amount of CO2 is being produced, yes, but also as a waste product, ethanol is being produced. The same microorganisms can also operate in aerobic conditions or in presence of air or oxygen. But then they wouldn't be producing any ethanol. Then it would be the typical rotting process, a typical oxygen oxidation, if you allow me to say so. While the fermentation is indeed an anaerobic process, it proceeds in the absence of oxygen, typically underwater. The water is also necessary, of course, for breaking down the solid structure of the fruit or the sugar-containing plant so that the microorganisms can reach those sugars diluted in the liquid, in the water. And of course, the ethanol is, as a result, is diluted in the liquid, in the water. And we have to extract it somehow. Fermentation of complex sugars is also possible, and the most common complex, easy but still complex sugar is the starch. It is a glucose polymer. It is comparatively easy to break into simple sugars and then ferment. And this is what happens actually if you would be making ethanol or vodka, say, from anything else but fruits. And that's what the typical vodka is made from. Barley. Why is it made from barley? Very simple answer. Because barley, corn på svenska, actually contains, the seeds contain, or the germinating seeds develop certain other types of microorganisms, which in turn are helping to break down the starch into sugars that are possible to ferment. This is a very interesting process, again quite natural, and people found it very long ago. The malting process, simply. So the malting process, conversion of barley into something that can ferment, then producing beer, and then distilling the beer into something else, either drinking the beer directly. Well, yeah, you can make beer also from honey. The old Vikings were doing that. Or distilling further the beer. This process came a little later. People didn't learn to do that in the old ages because now distillation is a thermochemical process. You have to heat up the thing and you have to treat it somehow. You have to contain it in a pressurized vessel and so on and so on. Typical vodka production, extracting the alcohol from a very diluted mixture and concentrating it into higher concentration. Now, this is how the typical whiskey still would look like. Now, I'm not encouraging you to drink. Think about technicians, or think put yourself in the shoes of a technologist here. It is not good to drink ethanol. Why? Because you would be wasting a wonderful fuel, wouldn't you? Technical ethanol being produced these days, very large scales actually, from all kinds of starch-containing foodstuffs. Mostly. It may not only be food stuff, but as long as the thing contains starch. It can be other part of a plant. It would work for ethanol production. That can be wheat, rice, corn, anything, maize that is, potatoes, cassava, anything that contains starch can be fermented. However, the natural process of transforming the starch into maltose is not there. We have to artificially add those enzymes here, or those microorganisms that would help us take this step. The industrial ethanol production, the typical ethanol plant, you can find plenty of those out there, and there is only one in Sweden. You see, it's not a very, very big actually size here, even if the production is quite approximately can be estimated as a large scale. It takes steam from a nearby wood-fired plant because the ethanol production process is energy intensive. What we produce is the common pure molecule of ethanol. Hopefully the pure molecule. It's actually difficult to absolutize ethanol to 100% purity. But usually it's not enough, it's not necessary to have it 100% pure. The ethanol needs to be distilled out. Once again, this is the most energy consuming process. And this is how the actual process would look like. I have actually calculated for you what may happen. Starting from a certain amount of wheat, milling it, malting it, adding the enzymes to produce the simple sugars, adding the yeast to perform the fermentation process, which actually exhausts a certain amount of carbon dioxide. So this is a mass and energy that we're losing from the process. It produces certain residue. Most of it can be used as fodder for animals, or can be burned, or can be digested as biogas, anything else. The product needs to be distilled. A lot of energy is actually invested here. It needs to be absolutized, which is a seemingly not that complicated process. And in the end, ending up as 1 liter of ethanol, this brings us to an efficiency of approximately 30%. Not that bad, but far from the 100% efficiency, definitely, and definitely not 100% CO2 neutral. If we take the further step into the second generation ethanol, it would be produced from cellulose. Cellulose, or any of its resembling or derivative structures, is a very complex polymer of the glucose. It can again be broken down to simple sugars, however, not so easily. There are two main processes that can be used to break down the cellulose into sugars: through acids or through enzymes. The process is a hydrolytic one, so we call it acid hydrolysis or enzymatic hydrolysis. This is high-level, top-notch chemistry. We're not going there, but please just know you are supposed to learn the basics here. Lignin always remains as a residue. It cannot be used for anything, but it can probably be burned or digested in a biogas digester. Anything of that sort is possible. The acid hydrolysis is a kind of a well-developed, however, not really cheap, quite low efficient and super polluting. You have an effluent in the end that you should treat. Enzymatic hydrolysis is promising, but it's not cheap either and needs further verification, definitely, and testing to be introduced in large scale. The production, the growing of the enzyme itself is a difficult process. Overall energy efficiency, going the cellulose route, approximately 20%. Not enough, but if we had the cellulose and if we could perform these processes easily and efficiently, that would be just fine. One example of a second generation ethanol process, please look at it. There are many others of the same style. What needs to be done is to break down the cellulose into simple sugars, saccharose, pentose, sexose, whatever. Then ferment them. Then do something with the residues and try to produce the final product with the least expenditure of external energy. This is like an overview of the different production routes or steps, starting from different actually crops or initial starch or sugar containing stuffs. This is how it might look like if we really attempt to break down the cellulose into simple sugars. It is a nasty process, quite close to the digesting of biomass for the production of cellulose for paper. However, here we are trying to break down the cellulose fibers. And within a certain amount of hours, actually, this is possible to do. They start to disintegrate, ending up into a nasty ooze. This would be the thing containing the sugars, smelling also as a typical digestion process. Being a fuel, or being used as fuel, ethanol is a perfect replacement of the gasoline. It can also be used, as a matter of fact, in diesel engines. And there are both gasoline engines in buses in Stockholm or small vehicles, and diesel engines in city buses, in the public transport buses, using ethanol. It is not such a straightforward process to use ethanol in diesels, but it's possible. We don't have time to get there. Of course, in gas turbines or any other kind of combustors, or in your water heater at home, you could be using ethanol too. There are certain challenges replacing gasoline with ethanol. First of all, cold start again. Just like with vegetable oils, cold start on a biofuel is always a problem. With the ethanol, the issue is that it does not readily evaporate at common temperatures. It actually evaporates at approximately 60, 70 something degrees Celsius. So you can't really start a cold engine, especially not at minus degrees temperatures. You would need to preheat the fuel and hopefully also preheat the engine to solve that. Or mix the fuel or the ethanol with a certain amount of gasoline. Ethanols or alcohols in general can be aggressive to natural rubber and corrosive to certain alloys. They can also, they are very good solvents, of course, all kinds of alcohols, especially the simple ones. So some kind of residues in your fuel system, silt or anything, impurities in the typical fossil fuel, if you change immediately to ethanol fuel, it will dilute those things and wash them towards the engine, plugging injectors, destroying seals, and all these things. Energy per mass and per volume is lower than fossil fuels, much lower than the vegetable oils. Ethanol generally has, we don't need to look at those figures, you can find them out there, you supposedly know them already, approximately half the heating value of gasoline. The combustion characteristics otherwise, and the typical parameters, they will be pretty much the same. The vicious pollutants, apart from the CO2 neutrality, with 100% or less of the ethanol fuel, all other kinds of pollutants would be pretty much the same. But if treated nicely and if combusted properly, ethanol would produce less pollutants in general, thanks to the fact that it has only a few carbon molecules, a lot of hydrogen molecules around, and this tricky one oxygen molecule, atom in the molecule, which actually helps to easily, first of all, do not produce soot, that would be carbon chains during the combustion process, produce less nitrogen oxides, definitely does not contain sulfur, so there wouldn't be any sulfur oxides, and so on and so on. But cold combustion may produce even worse pollutants with ethanol than with fossil fuels. For example, aldehydes. But this is a different story. The ethanol fuel market. Brazil is the best example. Already from the 1970s, after the first oil crisis, the Brazilian government decided that there is land enough, there is a potential enough in Brazil to produce locally ethanol from sugarcane, definitely. This was done, and it's still being done now. In the old days, 4 million cars, first generation ethanol cars, were were being driven around the Brazilian roads. Even today, you can drive on anything from 100% down to 20 or 10% ethanol in common fuel. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs were created, and that count continues to rise today. The ethanol production in Brazil is a massive industry. And indeed, Brazil supplies most of the, for example, Swedish ethanol market. If you go out and fill in your tank with E85, it would definitely be Brazilian ethanol there. In Europe and the US, for the common use, the E85, E10 and E20 fuels have been defined. And this is a quick summary of those typical fuel blends, ethanol blended with gasoline, for two main reasons. First of all, the cold start, and second, for easy standardization. From E5 all the way to E100, pure ethanol, most commonly as E85, 85% ethanol, the rest gasoline, or E10 to E15 in US and some other areas. This is a quick overview of the statistics. You can find those on your own on the internet or in good reports. Ethanol is being produced in large quantities, mostly in South America, primarily Brazil, the US, and quite a lot in Europe now. China and Canada are coming online. The biggest potential is Australia, Central America, and Africa, definitely. Eastern Europe maybe too. In the US, there are 211 ethanol producing plants as of 2012. There is quite a bit of a stagnation. Another slight drawback for the US production of ethanol is that, first of all, it's mostly produced from maize, from a food crop. It uses quite a bit of a fossil fuel, natural gas, in the production process. It is far from CO2 neutral. Also, the productivity of the land, of the crop input for the ethanol production is lower than the sugarcane production per unit land in Brazil. There are interesting figures and lots of reports which are focusing on defining and estimating, calculating the CO2 neutrality of ethanol. Find those, read them. We don't have time for them now. Ethanol production in the EU, primarily France and most of all Germany, and a little bit in the UK. This is the global statistics. It was growing exponentially from the year 2000 towards the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. It is stagnating after that. We don't even need to look at the statistics in the recent years. It is not much of an increase anymore, not much of an annual growth anymore. But actually, it's quite a bit of a production of ethanol for fuel purposes. This indeed includes here ethanol production for any other technical purpose. But the fuel use of ethanol out of the old technical applications actually is the biggest. Fermentation process occurs naturally and converts simple sugars into ethanol. Complex sugars, simple complex sugars like starch, can also be fermented by first breaking them down into simple sugars. Very complex sugar chains like the the polymer chains of the cellulose can also be broken down into simple sugars, but very difficult. And those processes need to be developed further if the second generation wood-based ethanol, for example, would be the promise for the future. Ethanol is a very good engine fuel. It actually performs better than gasoline in certain occasions, for example, as a racing fuel, and is being used around the world already now. CO2 neutrality, however, is difficult to estimate. Doesn't matter how you try. There is not enough data, and needs to be estimated properly if we would be defining now how good ethanol is in a sustainability perspective. Thank you.